Hi, we continue today in Luke 9 as Luke has Herod the ruler interrupt Jesus' engagement with the disciples around the sending of the 12 apostles and to hear what happened to them, which we see in verse 10 on their return. So Luke has inserted this section here as a kind of a surprise, breaking up the narrative a little bit. So we need to explore here how what Luke is doing is different than what Mark's doing and how his characterization of Herod is much more expansive and much more nuanced than what we see in Mark. So as we're going through chapter 9, as you can see on the right side of the screen, we're exploring the intersecting themes in this chapter between discipleship and Christology, which is to say the question of who Jesus is and then the question of what it means and what it looks like to follow him. So the purple parts here marked out are the ones that are about Jesus giving authority or about who he is, and the green ones are about the responses of the disciples. And as I said last time in the beginning of this chapter, this is really like a practice test for the disciples, their apprenticeship, their internship, if you will. They've been watching Jesus do what he does to heal and cast out unclean spirits and demons and to teach about the kingdom of God. And now it's their turn. But as you can see from their responses in the green along the way of this chapter, they don't really get any of them right. So they're going to need more training. And in fact, as we know from Luke, they argue in this chapter about which one is the greatest, and they'll do that again all the way at the almost very end at the Last Supper. So it's really not until after the resurrection and the road to Emmaus story and Jesus' encounter with them in Jerusalem that they really begin to get it. And that's why Luke has the Acts of the Apostles to show what it's like when they understand the power of resurrection and are filled with the Holy Spirit. So here is this interruption here in between the sending of the 12 and the response and then the hungry crowd. So that leads us to explore why Herod is inserted here. So if we look, we can see on the left what Mark does with Herod, and it's really one big scene and then a couple of implicit references. So you're probably familiar with the basic story of I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, where Herod gets all his courtiers around, and in a drunken celebration of his birthday, he lets Herodias decide what she wants, and that's what she wants. And so it's a mockery of political power there, and Luke leaves that whole thing out. He does not have that entire story. See, as you can see here, the parts are in bold are the parts that are common to both, not necessarily verbally identical, but at least thematically similar. Luke changes the language just a little bit, and we see not very much. So for Mark's readers, by the time we hear of Herod, Jesus has already been opposed by the Pharisees and others, and they've already plotting to kill him by the end of chapter 3. So Herod shows up here out of nowhere, and there's this one scene. And then in chapter 8, he's just warned about the yeast of Herod, but Herod isn't there. And then others sent to him some Pharisees and Herodians, so supporters of Herod, to trap him. But in the Passion story, we don't see Herod mentioned at all in Mark. It's just Pilate and the chief priests. Whereas Luke starts right in the beginning naming Herod. This King Herod is different than Herod the ruler here. And so to understand that, we'll look in a minute at the reign of Herods. But let's just look for a moment at what Luke does. So he tells us right in the very first verses of his gospel, in the days of King Herod of Judea. So that's Herod the Great, the friend of Caesar, who was appointed by his friend to be the Roman representative there. And now we're dealing later, after the days of King Herod in chapter 3, of course, when Jesus is around and is an adult, as is John the Baptist, time has passed. So in the 15th reign of the year of Emperor Tiberius, Herod is ruler of Galilee. His brother Philip, who's also a Herod, ruler of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, who's not a Herod, the ruler of Abilene. So already in chapter 3 later, we hear a passing reference to the problem that Mark lays out in a drama here. We don't have the drama. We hear Herod the ruler, notice he doesn't call him king, repeatedly, the tetrarch, who had been rebuked by him because of Herodias, his brother's wife, but we don't know why. Luke doesn't tell us what the rebuke is about, that he's marrying his brother's wife, but that isn't said here. And because of all the evil things that Herod had done, just generically, added to them all by shutting up John in prison. So Luke doesn't highlight the details of what Herod has done that have anything to do with anybody other than John or Jesus. But we already have a hint that there's an evil that he's done. So as a character, we're already oriented him as toward a bad guy. Now we get to our passage, and we'll look at it a little more closely, of course, as we explore it. But what's at issue here is what Herod thinks about Jesus. And notice the same three rumors are in Mark as in Luke, that it's John the Baptist raised from the dead, or it's Elijah, or it's one of the ancient prophets. And we'll explore that in detail. But that's not where Luke ends. In 1331, we hear that Herod wants to kill you. So in our passage today, we're going to hear that he tried to see him, and we don't necessarily know there's murderous intent there, although he'd already done evil things and shut up John in prison. So it shouldn't surprise us that Herod would end up opposed to Jesus, just as he was opposed to John. But then in the Passion story, he has a major part. And it starts off with the answer to what we see here. He tried to see him, and then we hear the narrator tell us when Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he'd been wanting to see him for a long time, because he'd heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. So this section here is dependent upon the section we have here. So in Luke, as we get to this section, we both know more and we will know more. And Herod is a much more of an important character than we saw in Mark. So let's look at the reign of Herods just for a minute. If you're not familiar with these, I won't go through all, and certainly not through this genealogical chart there, but it is helpful to have just a basic sense of things in the timeline. So Herod the Great, and I won't read all this, you can read it yourself. I'll post it as I always do on the webpage. This is the timeline for him. So he lived in the time before Jesus, and again, a friend of Julius Caesar. And so this is the next generation, and they're all Herods, but notice that Luke only refers to Herod Antipas as Herod. He says his brother Philip, but they're all Herods. That's their family name, and that goes first in their tradition. So he could have said Antipas here and Philip here, or he could have called them both Herods, which would have been confusing. And certainly Archelaus, who's the ruler over Judea, who's the one that's at issue in chapter 23, probably isn't the same one that's at issue here. And that's really important to see. The Herod we see here is reigning over Galilee, which is where they are. But the Herod here is reigning over Samaria and Judea. And that's the one who is going to be there in Judea when Jesus is on trial. So Luke manages to make them seem identical, even though here he made the distinction between Herod, ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, ruler of Iturea. Notice he doesn't name the one who's the ruler of Judea at all. And when we get down here, he simply says under Herod's jurisdiction and doesn't make the distinction that this is not the same person as the person here or here. So that's a little sleight of hand for folks who don't have this chart, is to say that all of these are acting out of the same intentionality, as if they were the same person. And we don't actually see Philip in the story. He's referenced there, but he's not actually a character in the story. So that's our structure. So let's look at the details of what he has to say, and then we'll have one more thing to share along with that. As Green notes down here, this little section provides an immediate co-textual constraint on how we are to understand the nature of what Herod has heard. He's concerned above all with the work of Jesus' emissaries, which is to say, those he's sending out right now. Who are these people who are scattering around the territory, apparently pronouncing a way of life that would be contrary to my rule? So that's the reality that he'd be concerned about. So again, calling him a tetrarch, not calling him a king. Heard about all that had taken place. It's interesting to wonder about what all that might be. We'll hear a similar thing a little later where John the Baptist, no, we heard it earlier, I'm sorry, where John the Baptist had heard all these things, and he sends two of his disciples to Jesus, and Jesus tells him, go back and tell John what you've seen and heard. So do we know that Herod has seen and the same things that John saw? The son of the widow of Nain raised from the dead, and healings, and does he know about the casting out legions and Gerasa on the other side of the river? We don't know exactly what he knows. And it's described as perplexed. Diapori, only in Luke, Acts in the New Testament. As we've looked at before, Luke really revs up the language of amazement. We can make this a little bigger here so we can see it. All the way back with language about wondering and perplexed. This is translated the same here as our verse, but it's not the same word in Greek. And I won't go through all this. Again, it's been posted on the website for a long time. But you see all this language of amazement, being astounded, being perplexed, etc., all the way through. And so here we are right here, which is to highlight that what people are experiencing is confusing their minds. They're not sure how to interpret it. They're not sure what it means for them. And so here's the reason why he's perplexed, and it raises a question that Luke doesn't answer, and most scholars don't really address, but I think it's an important question, at least to pause upon, and as I will in a moment. Because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, which is to say there's already an expectation, apparently not with any controversy, that people can be raised from the dead. It doesn't say who John had been raised from the dead by God, just by himself. The only tradition of resurrection that would have been known to Luke and his audience from the Bible would have been from Daniel 12, which is about the wise will rise into a resurrection of the just and get a reward, and the evil will rise to a resurrection of condemnation, which is, say, a general resurrection in which everybody will come out of the Sheol and be judged. But that's not what's being named here. Apparently, as if an individual person had been raised, as if that was just a possibility. And although the characters in the story and readers have seen Jesus raise the widow of Nain's son from death, that was a shocking element there. And yet here it's presented like it's just ordinary. But when Jesus tells the disciples that's what is going to happen to him, they don't seem to understand it. And they don't understand it all the way until after they experience it, after his crucifixion and when he actually does rise. So it's a curious thing there that the first thing that he might have heard from people, the rumor out there, is that John had been raised from the dead. Not that, notice that someone else is carrying on his ministry. That in his name, that might be something that we see like in Isaiah, in the 66 chapters of the canonical book of Isaiah. Most scholars would argue that it was composed over the course of at least 200 years, maybe longer, by people who are adding on to the Isaiah tradition. And certainly most modern scholars would say the same thing about the Pauline letters in the New Testament, that some of those, especially Titus and Timothy, were almost certainly not written by the Apostle Paul, but somebody else in his name, probably to tame his work, because it was too radical. So whether that was sort of the expectation here, it's not actually raised from the dead, but had come back, that's not what's said. What's being said here is raised from the dead, using the verb agyro, which is the resurrection verb, but it's also for ordinary raising, for people getting up off the ground or other things like that. But raised from the dead makes it specific. So that's the first possibility. The second is that Elijah had appeared. Now, what does that imply? Elijah famously went up to God in a whirlwind in a chariot. But did that mean he didn't die? Is he therefore like Enoch from Genesis 5, who it said was taken by God, but didn't say he died, and therefore could appear again? Certainly the expectation that we see at the end of the book of Malachi is that before the Messiah came, Elijah would appear. And even today, pious Jews practice having an Elijah seat at Passover, just in case the prophet were to show up and suggest the Messiah was near or coming this year. So there's been a long tradition of Elijah appearing, but notice that would not be resurrection. That would be someone who'd been taken up to God, returning again. So two possibilities for how people from the past could appear in the present. And finally, a third one, that one of the ancient prophets, ancient here, archaeon, for like we'd use the English word archaic, but the old prophets, not a recent prophet like John, in other words, but an old one like Elijah, but perhaps like Moses. Perhaps this is suggesting the Deuteronomy 18:15-18, I will send you a prophet like me. But that wouldn't be Moses, it would be a prophet like Moses. And in many ways, Jesus is a prophet like Moses, but he's not Moses. So the idea that ancient prophets had arisen, using a different word, anastemi here, 27 times in Luke, but as my note suggests from Green, perhaps as the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18, it's hard to say. But notice all three of these involve somebody from the past making an embodied return, which is saying something about the rumors out there on the streets about the possibilities of not only life after death, but the inability to silence the voices who criticize kings. And that's certainly what Elijah was known for with his jousting with King Ahab and Ahab's prophets. So Herod responds here, and notice how he responds differently than we saw in Mark. In Mark, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. Here it says, John I beheaded, but who is this? So it separates out the possibility that John had been raised from the dead here into the narrator's comment, and then Herod's live comment, John I beheaded. Notice the word for beheading here is associated only with John the Baptist's death, and it's in the obscure Psalm 151, verse 7 of the Septuagint. You might think, wait a minute, the book of Psalms only has 150 Psalms. Well, that's true in the Hebrew, in the Masoretic text, but there's an extra one in the Septuagint. So it's a rare word. The idea that he would be beheaded, interestingly, suggests he was a member of the elite at some level, or at least Herod saw him as that. Jesus isn't beheaded. He's crucified, as we know, and others could simply be dispatched through any kind of ordinary killing. So to behead somebody was to suggest he was somebody of influence and power. Roman citizens are beheaded. John is certainly not a Roman citizen. There's no reason to think that. And yet here it is, and consistent with Mark, that he was beheaded. And then this question, who is this? So this is going to be juxtaposed with Jesus' own question to the disciples, who do others say that I am? And then who do you say that I am? Highlighting this theme of Christology throughout here. So it'll alternate between Herod wondering and the crowd that needs to be fed. Do the disciples know who Jesus is? Jesus telling them more about discipleship, and then God saying who Jesus is, but the disciples not knowing what to do. So we'll get the definitive answer at the center here in the Transfiguration story. Just a couple of last details here. So who is this about whom I hear such things? The word for such things, toiauto, here is twice in Luke, and it's not really important to see it in 18:16, but it highlights the fact that we don't know exactly what Herod has seen or heard. Here it's heard all about that had taken place, and here it's such things, but it's still not specified what it is exactly that Herod had heard. And he tried or sought, zetio, to see him. Zetio has an ambiguous word. It can mean to seek in an ordinary sense, but it can mean to hunt down as well. So it's not clear from the context here, is it seeking just to get to know or seeking to hunt down? But from what I've shown you here, we'll find out that he wants to kill Jesus. So that's our section of Herod, and we'll return to the apostles telling Jesus what they'd done and encountering a crowd that is hungry and the question of what should be done with this hungry crowd. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.